O you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes plastic Jesus hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you? Are you so foolish? Having begun in the spirit, you're now perfected by the flesh. I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, your Christian whistleblower. Many of you will recognize those words as the words of the self-proclaimed Apostle Paul, and you'll recognize those from the book of Galatians, and that is, of course, the 3rd chapter. And I'm reading from the very first verse of the 3rd chapter, coming to you from deep inside the NCK bunker here as we get things down to the brass tacks, really making an effort to get out on the road and doing what we feel like we need to do, feel like we want to do. But I wanted to talk to you today. And Paul said, "Oh, you foolish Galatians," and I'm coming to you today with, "Oh, you foolish Christians," because what you've been bought and sold is the utmost in stupidity, and I'll define stupidity. It's the utmost in hate, and it also is and has set the example, if you will, for much of the hatred, bloodshed, and ethnic cleansing that has taken place from that time to this. So, oh, you foolish Christians, who has bewitched you? You started out in the spirit by following the message of the original Yeshua movement, and then turned yourself back to Paul, who created a religion that was very, very much removed and different from that of Yeshua and his apostles. So let's take a look at this today, and it all centers in the Galatians. And let me grab my handy dandy notes here. We've read Galatians 3:1, and basically the scenario is this: the Galatians, in Paul's eyes, had started out in the spirit, and they were now going back, quote unquote, to the flesh. And if we get into Galatians 4, this is when he really jumps on them. Galatians 4, chapter 10, and this is the central verse of what we're talking about in Galatians chapter 4, verse number 10. He says, "You observe days and months and times and years. I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed labor upon you in vain." You're turning again. You're turning back to the weak and beggarly elements that you desire to be in bondage to again. You're observing days and months and times and years. So Paul's saying, you Galatians, who's bewitching you? You're falling back into weak and beggarly elements. You're falling back into days, months, times, years. And we've been taught, and you've been taught as Christians for your entire life of Christianity, that Paul's talking about the Galatians falling back into Jewish bondage, falling back into Jewish legalism. Is that the truth or not? And does it actually hide some very nefarious truths? Does it actually hide some very nefarious things that you have been sold that simply are not true? I ask you, first of all, who was Paul the apostle to? Well, don't believe me. Let's take it from Paul's own mouth. In Romans chapter 11 and verse number 3, Paul tells us who he is the apostle to. And I'm going to show you this. So it's 11:13, I'm sorry. Paul tells you who he is the apostle to. And I'll show you this. I don't know if you can see it very well, but you can go to your own Bibles, Romans 11:13. But I will show you exactly who Paul, according to his own word, is the apostle to. So Paul says right here in 11:13, "For I speak to you Gentiles, insomuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles." Paul said, "I am the apostle of the Gentiles." As you watch my cursor, I am, and in this way, it's a cursor in more than one way, because I do curse the false apostle Paul, and I am showing you his words here. I am the apostle to the Gentiles. There we go. I am the apostle to the Gentiles. Who was Paul the apostle to? Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. So Paul is saying that the Galatians were falling back into something. Okay, so if Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles and the Galatians are falling back into something, that you can't fall back into something you haven't been in. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, so ergo the Galatians were Gentiles. Well, Jeff, that's a little bit subjective. I don't know if I really want to just take your word for the fact that the Galatians were Gentiles. Okay, that's no problem. So let's go ahead and get some objective evidence on who the Galatians were. And again, I'll give you a look at this so you know exactly what I'm doing. At no time do my fingers, leave my hands. But we're, of course, looking at Wikipedia. I'm looking at Galatia, the entry for Galatia or the Galatians. Now look at this. Galatia was named for the immigrant Gauls. Galatia was named for the immigrant Gauls. The people in Galatians were Gauls. And of course, that word Gauls is a hyperlink. So I press on Gauls. Who's the Gauls? Well, the Gauls were Celtic peoples. The Gauls were Celtic peoples. Okay, well, who are the Celts? Well, if we click on the Celts are Celtic peoples. They had Celtic languages. And if you pull down here, you can find out about their religion. Their religion, what was the Celts' religion? Polytheism. Like other European Iron Age tribal societies, the Celts practiced a polytheistic religion. Are you starting to see what I'm talking about? Paul said to the Galatians, who were Celts, who were polytheists, you're falling back into the stuff you used to do, days, weeks, months, years. Whatever that was, my friend, it was not Judaism. They could not fall back into Judaism because they were never Jews. They were polytheists. You've been lied to, hoodwinked. You have been completely set up. Let me show you the days, months, and years that Paul was accusing them of falling back to, and this makes perfect sense to us. What Paul was telling them that they were falling back into was the Moad. And if my memory doesn't fail me, that's from Genesis chapter 1, verse number 14. Let's see how good the old preacher is, if he's able to grab it, the right exact verse. Genesis 1:14. Well, he's a little bit off. Oh, no. He hit it completely on, folks. Because here's what Paul was talking about in Genesis 1:14. Let's go ahead and show you this too, because I get these people, oh, you're just making it up and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, well, check this out. And God said, or the gods, Elohim, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, seasons, days, years. If we go to, this is a great way to show you how to do this. That's the verse just in the King James Version. And if I go up here to interlinear, it's going to dump me into Genesis 1:14 interlinear. And God, you can see God, Elohim, God, Elohim. God did not say it. The Elohim said it. Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, and let them be for seasons, days. If you look at the word, it's actually Moad. There you go, Moed. And what does it mean? It means the appointed festivals, times, and seasons of the Lord. So what the Galatians were doing of the Elohim, not the Lord, strike that. So what the Galatians were doing is the Galatians were going back to their original polytheistic ways of worshiping the original days, seasons, months, and years that the Elohim had told them to follow. So Paul is telling these people, don't go back to what the Elohim told you to do. Keep following my way. But they have allowed us to believe from that day to this that it was the Jews that bewitched, the Galatians to go back into Judaism, but they were never Jews, the Galatians. So Paul set up the first human shields for his jihad. He said that it was the Jews that tempted the Christians, the first Christians, to go back into bondage. And from that day to this, we thought, oh, it was the Jews. It was the Jews. The Jews had nothing to do with it. How many millions of people have been slain at the altar of Paul's false doctrine, of Paul's human shield? Paul launched the first jihad. Pauline Christianity, not really, because they were Jewish jihads before that. You've got to remember the Jews going to the promised land. That was somebody else's land. The people they killed to get that land, they were already there. That's called jihad. That's called bloodshed. So the Galatians were not Jews. They were polytheists. What they fell back into was not Judaism. It was the original earth worship, the original polytheistic Elohim worship that was introduced to them from the beginning in Genesis 1:14. Paul clearly stood against that. And if you follow Paul, you clearly stand against that. What you going to do now that the reality of the biblical text has broken out all over you? I'm Jeffrey Darty, your Christian whistleblower, and I'm wishing you peace and light, and above all things, I'm encouraging you to unindoctrinate yourself.